So I can just tell you what we've been trying to do, and we were approached very early by our friend Khalid Nasrallah, who works for UNRWA in Rafah. Khalid was one of the brothers who was in the house where Rachel stood when she was killed in 2003. And Khalid is responsible for one of the, now I think 90 UNRWA schools that are housing people. And we've watched the populations grow in those schools. When we were first in touch with him about this, there were about 2,000, I think, 2,200 in this school. And it is in Rafah. It was the Rafah boys school. And he had a way, he knew that there were sanitation products in places in Rafah that could be, he felt he could get into the school because they didn't have enough of all the things that Ron was talking about. And so we did immediately promise support to him. If he was able to get these things into the school, it's well documented, into the school immediately, that he would be able to provide sanitation kits. We're working with the Rebuilding Alliance to do this, and the project has grown. And basically what we're doing is really supplementing what is being delivered. You saw the water truck that came. Right now, water is a huge need. Khalid said that what they're delivering is just not adequate. So if they can find other sources for water, then he's trying to bring that into that particular school. We've actually had deliveries to some other schools now too, and we're focusing on Rafah just because it's a piece that we can try to manage. And there are other organizations, so I guess I would just appeal to you, I would just urge you to look for the ways, whether it's through like Friends of UNRWA USA or through the Middle East Children's Alliance or through what we're doing. Some way we will all figure out how to get that funding there to do the best that we can do. Because the need is pretty unimaginable right now, with 500,000 people displaced. I'll just say too about that school, the one that where Khalid is in charge, is the last school that was bombed, where 11 were killed just the other day prior to the ceasefire. And he had just arrived there. He actually was able to stay in his house. He talked about how he was putting in very long days, and then he would call us after he got back home again in the late night or early morning. But he had just arrived back right before that bombing took place, where the people were killed. I don't know what more to say. I think we're all trying to figure out how the situation evolves, because it's a very desperate situation.
Cindy, I think it's helpful to be more explicit about, at least to me, about what you mean by a sanitation kit, or I will.
Well, you can come and help me, because I'm pretty tired, actually. Yeah.
It's pretty appalling, but this was 2 weeks ago, I think, when we started on this project, and Khalid was saying that if you go into the school with 2,000 people there, you would choke. It was just the smell, the stench. And so what we're talking about here is Pampers, sanitary napkins, towels, soap if it can get some water. So it's just really basic sort of personal things. Toothbrushes, toothpaste, the sort of stuff you can imagine if you're going 3-4 weeks without any of that, and you were poor to begin with and you had to leave everything behind and run for your life. What that might mean. And of course now then the school's been bombed again, so it's even worse. But we're trying to do what we can. We can't of course get things there, but if there's anything left in that economy, they're amazingly willing to part with that on a handshake and a promise from us here in Olympia, and we need to look out to the community to make that promise come true.
Thank
So
you.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So do you have a list, I mean, for people who would like to do this through a website, perhaps we can give more than what we have in our list?
Yeah, you can actually go to our website, and we have this particular project. It's called Emergency Shelter. Is Vanessa here? Emergency Shelter Relief or something like that. If you go to our website, it lists that. RachelCoreyFoundation.org. Yeah, we'll get you there. And there's also something that's separate just for Gaza projects also, but this one is specific to that. Yeah.
As you said, it's going to be unlivable after 2020. That's the prediction.
Yeah.
Is there any plan somewhere? Are people thinking how to live? What's going to happen after 2020? Is there a plan somewhere? Are people thinking about it? What's going to happen to that population, which is stopped?
You should repeat the question. Sure. So the question was, if the report says, is Gaza livable by 2020, and the conclusion in the report is no, then is there any kind of plan on what to do after 2020? And I think a large part of this is, again, even some of these organizations that are ostensibly apolitical are saying you have to end the siege. You cannot continue the siege. There has to be ways to develop the sewage infrastructure. There have to be ways to develop alternative forms of agriculture. There have to be ways that Gaza can actually be connected with the rest of the world, or you're going to have a humanitarian crisis. Israel can let in 2,000 calories per person per day if they want to, but that's not going to prevent this humanitarian crisis from happening. So the largest point now is the siege has to stop. And what's interesting about this is Hamas has been saying this from the beginning, is that they're willing to do a ceasefire, they won't fire rockets anymore, they won't build tunnels anymore, if the siege is lifted. And so far Israel's response has been no. We're going to end this on our terms. But I think many Gazans are actually sitting there hoping and saying, we're going to stand by Hamas as long as they can actually deliver something here. Right? The siege has to end, and that's really the point. If you want to build a desalination plant, you need electricity, you need filters, you need tubes, you need the pipes that you need to repair the water infrastructure. All of that has to come in. You can't have Israel controlling all of that. There has to be some way to get it in there. So I think that's the major concern. So the question is, do you know whether Gaza has any access to off-the-grid electrical systems, such as simple solar panels? It sounds very much like Gaza needs to unplug from its forced dependence upon Israel. It's a great question. It's actually an excellent question, and I think the whole notion of using alternative energy is an important one in terms of working with Gaza. I think one of the problems is first of all, again, when you have such a dense population, right? How are you going to get enough surface area to build solar panels that will actually provide enough power for the basic needs? Right? You can build it on roofs, right? But they're also using the roofs for gardens. And they're also, the roofs are not a safe place to put solar panels, right? One of the news reports that came out, I think, about 10 days ago was Jawal, which is the cellular network, the cell phone network. We're saying we're going to have to shut down the network in Gaza. We're going to have to cut off Gaza from cellular communication, not because they want to, but because so many of the buildings that had the cellular towers on them have been blown up, right? So, and one of the concerns is I have a cousin who's done some work with solar power in the southern West Bank in the Hebron Hills area. And they've built these solar power systems for these small villages, and the Israelis have destroyed the solar panels 6 times. So, I think the idea is that, absolutely, there have to be alternative methods of development, right? There have to be alternative sources of power, alternative methods of agriculture. There's an organic store in Gaza City, right? You can go to the organic store, which is, it's great. But at one point I asked them, I like it, and I did buy all my vegetables from there just because I wanted to support them, but I said to them, how do you call this organic? Because the water you're putting on there is contaminated with agricultural waste and with poop. So, and they said, well, okay, it's more organic, right? We're not making it any worse. So, right? And the food was good. So, okay, fine. But this is one of the concerns. Is that I think moving away from sort of the industrial form of development is an important thing to do in Gaza. But again, you have this situation now where you have this density and a hostile sort of belligerent who won't allow these kinds of projects to happen, right? And again, with desalination, I mean, 50 megawatts of power is a massive amount of electricity, and this would only provide about a quarter of the needs of Gaza for clean water. So you see, it's a great question, and I think it's something that needs to be pursued, but it needs to be done very carefully. And I'll just say one more thing about that, because I think it's really interesting, and something I talk to my friends in Gaza about all the time. So the UNDP, the UN Development Program, created a project which actually sounds great. So what they did is they went into some of these, in the camps, and they went into some of these high-rise buildings, and what they did is they said, look, if you have fish, they poop out fertilizer, right? And then you can run it through plants, and the plants will filter the fertilizer, and as they filter it, they'll use the nutrients and grow. Then the water's good for the fish again, so you just go around and around and around. It's a great idea. I mean, it's a closed system. It's a good thing to do. The whole system ran on electric pumps. And so when there was no power, the fish died, the plants died. And you know, one of the things you have to ask about this is what kind of an idiot puts together a system that requires electricity in this way in their search for alternative development, right? It's a real oversight, and clearly the work of someone who's never actually been to Gaza and never actually seen what the problems are there. Yeah.
Two questions, but the first, I've been in touch a lot with our American powers that be. How do we get into any kind of dialogue or get any kind of comment or anything through to the Israeli government?
Wow, that's a great question. So the question is, so
how do we contact them?
how do you contact the Israeli government? So if you want to put pressure on your local representatives, which I know some people in Olympia have been doing, is putting some pressure on the local representatives, and there is, what's that?
We have call your reps talking to you back here to call your local representatives, because the likelihood that you'll get to the actual Israeli government is pretty low. But you could contact our own Washington senators, and then they can by association put pressure on the Israeli government. So we have a whole bunch of quarter sheets back here with how to call local representatives, as well as the White House's number on here in case you were interested.
I think it's an interesting question, and part of, I think part of the issue is that there is a certain cynicism that goes along with this, right? In the sense of, if you call Netanyahu tomorrow to get his home number, and you're like, hey man, you really shouldn't have done that. Like, is he going to care? Well, no, he's not. But I think there is sort of a self-consciousness among Israelis. They're starting to feel this isolation, right? They're starting to feel some pressure. And I think making contact is actually really important, right? I think even calling people who are your foes and making contact with your foes, and you can find the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you can find the contact information from members of Knesset, by all means do, right? Let them know that you're watching. Let them know that you're unhappy with what's going on. Because one of the things that Israel always says is, you don't know what it's like to live here, you have no right to say anything, and my response to them is, fine, give us the $30 billion back. Because we obviously don't know what it's like over there. So, give us the money back. So, in that context, there are these petitions going around for an arms embargo on Israel, which I think is actually quite important. You're actually seeing some of the mainstream human rights organizations getting behind this. You are actually starting to see, I guess, Spain, what was it today? Spain decided to stop exports of arms to Israel. So you are starting to see some small changes. And I think, yes, let's do that pressure, but also put pressure on the Israelis themselves.
Second question. Where are the Arabs? Where are the other Arab nations? And why is Gaza? Why are the Palestinians left swinging on the rope in the wind?
I share your frustration. I can't answer the question for you. But I think one of the ways to think about this is Arab governments don't respond to their own populations, with some exceptions. Tunisia, for example, is sort of a great exception to this now after 2011. You're actually seeing more responsive government in Tunisia. But for the most part, these governments don't respond to their own populations. So why would they respond to Palestinians? Palestinians are constantly used. They're used as a political football. So the government will say, we're going to adopt this X, Y, and Z policy because look how terrible it is what they do to the Palestinians. But when Palestinians are actually in need of aid, these countries are nowhere to be found. And Qatar might issue a statement saying, it's really bad that this is happening. Right? And that's the end of it. When you talk about Egypt, now Egypt is much worse in this scenario. And I think one of the things to understand is with the January 25th revolution in Egypt, right, you had the toppling of Mubarak. Mubarak was essentially a figurehead. The people who'd been running the show in Egypt were the SCAF, which was the military. Okay, the military controls 50% of the Egyptian economy, right? I mean, the military, it's got its tentacles in every aspect of Egyptian society. So Morsi, when he was in power, a lot of Gazans made fun of Morsi because they're like, this guy's incompetent, he can't do anything right? He can't do anything. But Morsi, I think, was making some attempts to make some changes, but was limited and was really boxed in. And yes, he was a little bit incompetent, but was also boxed in by the military regime. When Morsi was overthrown, right, he was replaced with Sisi. Sisi, who is very much connected to the United States and very much connected to Israel, right? And one of the things that came out with the whole counter-revolutionary movement called Tamarod was they were actually funded by the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy. So there are some very close connections that are going on. And what this means then is that the military is working very closely, the Egyptian military is working very closely with the United States, it's also working very closely with the Israelis. Right. So what you have in Egypt is not a country which is unwilling to say something when violations are happening, it's a military which is actually conducting those violations themselves. Right. It's an organization which is openly hostile to Gazans and is also willing to allow the Israelis to use the Sinai as a military base. Right. So that's a short answer to your question, but that's where it's a long answer to a short question, but that's yeah.
In the area of political pressure, I have been following the Jewish Voice for Peace, and I found that it will generate things that you can sign and send in and put political pressure on. Have you comments about that?
Not really. I mean, I think Jewish Voice for Peace is actually doing some great work. And I think they've made some real strides in terms of bringing attention to what's going on, and also, breaking the conflation of Judaism and Zionism. I think they've done some really important work in this way, and I think they should be, applauded for that, and should be supported in those ways.
And I've signed several of their petitions and to send up. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Jewish Voice for Peace has been extremely vocal, particularly in this last attack, where they're very, very open about what the problems are, and I think they're adopting an honorable stance in this. So absolutely, I think Jewish Voice for Peace is another great place to go. Yeah.
Why did Hamas accept the truce now? Do they feel that they've achieved something important are they going to be invited to the table in Egypt as the representative?
Well, they are in Egypt already, right? Hamas, Islamic Jihad, PFLP, these are the main groups that are in Cairo, as well as the Palestinian Authority. Like, all of these groups are there. Why they accepted a ceasefire now, it's hard to say. I mean, I'm not part of the Hamas leadership in that regard. I mean, I think we can sort of consider what some of the options are. I mean, the cost for Gazans is incredibly high. And there are only so many rockets that Hamas can make, and there are only so many tunnels that can be dug. So, it could very well be that Hamas is thinking that at this point maybe we can actually make some headway. I think we'll see in the next couple of days what actually happens. Like, have they actually managed to inflict enough of a cost to get some real negotiation here or not? I certainly don't know the answer to that.
And how does Abbas fit into this picture?
Well, I think from the beginning, Abbas has been an incredibly problematic figure here, and one of the paradoxes here is that in 2007, according to the Palestine Papers, which were this whole series of papers released by Al Jazeera about the negotiations between Olmert and the Palestinian Authority, is Abbas had actually asked the Israelis to reoccupy Rafah, right? Because he was so furious with Hamas for taking over the Gaza Strip. And so one of the things that occurred recently was Israel was actually threatening to take over Rafah, and then you heard Abbas making these public statements about Israel's intransigence. But I mean, this is a problem, and one of the things that you're seeing in Gaza, for example, is the support that Hamas has received right now is not just against Israel; it's also against Fatah, right? And you're also seeing this in Jerusalem. You're also seeing it in the West Bank. There's an incredible amount of frustration. This frustration's been there from the beginning, right? From 2007, when there was a coup in the West Bank and Fatah took over. From that point on, there has been this massive amount of frustration among Palestinians with Fatah. But you see it boil over every once in a while, and I think this summer it boiled over again. And this is why you're starting to see more demonstrations. You're seeing demonstrations in these small Druze villages in the north in what Palestinians call 1948 territories, right? In the Galilee, you're starting to see demonstrations by groups that have, in the past, been fairly quiet. But now you're starting to see these demonstrations and people saying, enough is enough. We're not going to allow this to continue. So is this the third Intifada? I don't know. It's too early to tell. But I think there is so much frustration with Abbas and with Saeb Erekat and the entire Fatah leadership that, something has to change there as well.
On that topic, so we were hiking in the West Bank in November, staying with Palestinian families, and what I noticed is that there was three categories of people that they talked about. They talked about the military, both the Palestinian military and what there is of that, and the Israeli military, the internationals, and then the people, the Jewish people and the Palestinian people.
Okay.
And one fellow, I thought, really summed this up. I just been thinking a lot about it. He says, I bet the third Intifada is going to be the people, the Jewish people and the Palestinian people uprising against their militaries. And I'm just wondering what you think about that, and if you've heard similar cohesion, I guess, of just among regular people.
Okay, so the question is, so your experience was walking in the West Bank. You met people who were talking about a third Intifada, and they said the third Intifada is going to be against
the Jewish people and the Palestinian people will uprise together against their governments.
Right. It would be lovely. I mean, that would be great. What you're seeing now is, you don't see this among the Israelis, right? You do see I'm not going to discount, there are small numbers of Israelis who are actually taking a courageous stand. They are standing against their government and standing against the invasion. Many of them are getting beaten at their demonstrations, right? Many of them are getting pepper sprayed not by the police, right? By other Israelis who are saying that you're not a patriot, you love Hamas. One of the chants, before I even left, one of the chants that was heard in Jerusalem in one of these demonstrations was "Death to Arabs, death to leftists." So, yeah, to leftists. So there is a massive amount of support right now for the Israeli government in Israeli society. In terms of Palestinians, nationalism is a complex problem. Palestinians are living in a colonial or a colonized society. So, you can look at any of the readings of colonialism, and you can see these kinds of dynamics going on, where there's this massive amount of frustration with what is essentially a colonial government. So what do you do in that context? It's not an easy answer, but again, I think it would be great to see something like this, but I'm not seeing it right now.
There's this constant accusation that Hamas was given funds to reestablish some of the structural damage that's been done to the community, and they used it on weapons instead. My first question is there any truth to that? The second is, for someone learning about this entire conflict kind of as a new entrant to it, unfortunately, do you have recommended sources to help wade through the crap?
Good. So there's two questions here then. One question is, what about the Israeli claim that massive amounts of money have been infused into the Hamas government and they wasted it on rockets, right? They wasted it on rockets and, whatever sort of military hardware they want. And then the other part of the question is, where are some sources that we can use? Has Hamas spent money on military hardware? Yes. Sure they have. Does Hamas talk to Iran? Sure they do. Do they talk to Syria? Yes, they do. Do they talk to Hezbollah? Yes, they do. Who does Israel talk to? I think these kinds of claims, and I'm not being facetious here, but the idea that Israel would criticize Hamas for spending money on the military is ludicrous, right? With the amount of money that you and I are spending for the Israeli military, right? The idea that Israel would complain about Hamas spending money on the military is nonsense. In terms of further answering that question, most of the international donors have actually been building what they say they're going to build, and that's a big problem. So, for example, one of the biggest donors to the Gazan economy is Qatar. The little island in the Persian Gulf, and it's a little island, but they got a lot of cash. What they've been doing is they've been building roads, right? And what they've been doing is they've rebuilt the Gaza port 3 times. Right? Now, when I say Gaza port, it's not a port that you can actually bring a ship into, but it is where the fishers have their boats. Now, why do you need to rebuild the Gaza port 3 times? I'm not entirely sure. Like, it was crappy before, but it's okay if it's crappy and it works, right? They've put up signs saying don't fish here. Right. So Qatar has infused a great deal of money. Bahrain has put money into it as well. Most of these have gone into development programs, but if you know much about international development, most international development is about making yourself more wealthy, right? So, for example, the USAID builds roads in the West Bank that go nowhere. And then they put up a big sign saying, thanks to the USAID, right? This is, so, in terms of has the money that's gone into Gaza for development been effective? Not particularly, no. There have been some projects that have been funded that needed to be funded. But the idea that this development cash has gone into buying rockets, unlikely, right? I mean, there are other ways that organizations can get money, and Hamas has a very contentious relationship with Iran, but there has been in the past a relationship there. So, for example, some of the rockets we know came from Iran. That's not a big secret, everybody. We know that's ridiculous. But that said, that doesn't explain the situation in Gaza, and to say that that's why Israel is attacking them is nonsense. Now, where do you go to sort of pull some of this information apart? Well, actually, Jewish Voice for Peace, as you mentioned, is actually a great source. There are a few authors that are actually quite good. Sarah Roy is probably the world's foremost non-Gazan expert on Gaza.
R-O-Y.
R-O-Y. S-A-R-A-R-O-Y. She's at Harvard. She's been doing research in Gaza for more than 20 years. She's also a very friendly, warm person. She's a good person to know. But she understands Gaza inside and out. And her analysis is quite good. It's an economistic analysis. She's very much interested in political economy, but and I don't say that's a bad thing, but sometimes it's a little bit overly focused on the economy, but it's a great analysis. So, certainly I would pick up anything Sarah Roy's written and use that as a starting point. Ilan Pape, Joel Bainan, there's a few of these academics who have done research into the situation in Gaza and are speaking about them. And they're great sources. They're Palestinian sources as well. Noura Arakat, who's one. She's a legal scholar based at Temple University. She's a good source as well. Excuse me, George Bisharat is another good source in terms of legal analysis. So there's a few of these different sources, and those are a good place to start. Okay. So the question is, I'll confess that I sometimes enjoy listening to some programs on KUOW, which is Seattle's NPR. What I don't enjoy is hearing how slanted their, in quotes, news reports are regarding this ongoing situation. Me too. I'm repeatedly hearing that Israel was completely oblivious to the existence of the trade tunnels and that the principal use of these sinister tunnels is for arms smuggling. Okay. So what are the tunnels about? Were they used for arms smuggling? Well, let's say this. Were arms smuggled through the tunnels? Yeah, they were. That's true. So was everything else, right? Fuel was smuggled. They actually had an underground pipeline that went from Rafah, from one side of Rafah to the other side, the Egyptian side to the Palestinian side. I mean, everything came through these tunnels. At the very beginning of the tunnels, they were unregulated, so who knows what people were bringing in at that point. But what you could see was, again, just walking through the different cities in Gaza, you had, back in 2009, they had things called tunnel markets. And these were little markets that popped up in the middle of the street with all this Chinese equipment, refrigerators, air conditioners, televisions, everything, generators, little tuk-tuks. They would just be in the middle of the street, and everyone knew where they came from. They came from the tunnels, right? So yeah, everything was brought in through the tunnels. This whole sort of, for lack of a better word, and I know it's a problematic term, but this whole hysteria around tunnels is really problematic. You know, why are tunnels such a fearful thing? Why is it so problematic that there's tunnels? And the reason is, it's the only way around the siege. Israel can't control them, right? So the United States built, or paid the Egyptians to build an electrified steel wall that went 35 feet underground, right? All along the border. And what you'll find is in Gaza, there's lots of buildings that have this wall that they have cut out with welders and now put on to fix holes in their walls. Like they completely dismantled it. It was electrified, and they figured out a way, whatever, use gloves, cut a hole in it, right? And that's, again, our tax money that paid for that. But there have been these various attempts to stop the tunnels from happening. What really did the tunnels in was when Sisi came into power in Egypt and flooded them with sewage. This was the collapse of the tunnel economy when that occurred. I'll tell you this, I felt like I had a little secret when I went there in June. It's like, oh my God, there's still some tunnels. There's like 6, right? There's still a few tunnels. And I went, there was an area in southern Rafah where they had a warehouse, a tunnel warehouse that was funded with international donors. And they had built this massive warehouse just for the tunnel trade, right? Huge. I mean, I'm not even sure how to convey to you how big this is. I mean, it was easily 2 or 3 city blocks in size. It's massive. There was one pickup truck there, and they had some laptops. So, it was empty. The whole area was empty except for this one pickup, and they had smuggled in some laptops. So there were still a couple tunnels running. But according to the folks that I was talking to, and they wouldn't go on record or anything, but they were saying there are about 6 that are still running. Weapons weren't getting in at that point, right? As to your other question, the Israelis are shocked, I tell you, that there's tunnels, right? That was their attitude. The Israelis knew there were tunnels the whole time. When we were there in 2009, we heard the F-16s bombing the tunnels. Like, everyone knew the tunnels were there. Like, the Egyptians knew they were there, the Israelis knew the tunnels were there. There was no question. The tunnels were actually really helpful to Israel, right? Because if not, you would have seen a humanitarian crisis much earlier.
So, in the big picture then, we're talking about building momentum for moral outrage. We don't see any of that in the media. NPR is just one of those. The picture that I'm creating in my mind is that these people are being obliterated. It just seems like, okay, they're going to go away because no one wants to look at this. I mean, where is the real support for Palestine anywhere? I don't hear it here. I hear the problems. I don't hear the support.
I think, okay, so
institutional support, countries supporting.
So the question is then, well, how do I make that into a question? It was, so the question is, with the media, you don't hear about any support. You don't get any real analysis. And I think there's been a number, actually, of Jewish American authors who've called this a genocide, saying it is actually a genocide. Here's the problem. 1.8 million Gazans, right? All under Israeli occupation. Under the international law of occupation, there's 2 options. You either annex or you withdraw, right? And that goes for Gaza, it goes for the West Bank, it goes for Jerusalem, it goes for the Golan or the Golan Heights. Israel has 2 options under international law. You annex or you leave. If you annex, everyone who lives there becomes a citizen. Okay? So Israel has been talking about this for a very long time. They call it the demographic problem. Right? If you annex the West Bank and Gaza and the Golan, now you no longer have a strong Jewish majority in Israel. Okay? So what Israel's solution has been this whole time is the occupation is great for Israel in this respect. You don't have to annex them. You don't have to give them citizenship rights. You still have this massive Jewish majority in Israel, and it remains this Jewish state. You can't have a Jewish state and a democracy in a place where there are more local people that are non-Jewish than Jewish. That's the contradiction. So in this regard, the problem is there's no end game for Gaza. What do? There's 1.8 million people there. Are you going to absorb them? Are you going to make them all citizens? They're pretty pissed. They're probably not going to vote for Likud next time. So what do you do with these guys? And so the idea is you keep them in limbo. And in terms of international support, I think, no, you don't have large-scale international institutional support, and this is where we talk about the culpability, right? The EU is responsible for the siege. The United States is responsible for the siege. Japan is responsible for the siege. Every group which claims the siege is legal because Hamas is a terrorist organization is culpable for the siege. It is their fault, right? The siege could not continue.
So you do not think Hamas is a terrorist organization?
Well, I think the problem is most countries, when they're dealing with an insurgency, their insurgents are called insurgents. Insurgent versus terrorist are two different international classifications. An insurgent group is a problem. A terrorist group is someone that everyone in the world is supposed to target,
Right.
and that everyone in the world is supposed to shut down. I think, particularly after 2003, when Hamas abandoned the use of suicide bombing and said that no longer Israeli civilians would be targets, when that occurred, then to say that Hamas was worse than any of the insurgent groups that existed in the rest of the world, and for some reason deserved the title of terrorist, is problematic, right? And at the same time, when you use these terrorist terms and then say you use the Gazan and Hamas interchangeably, that means anyone can be a target, and this is what Israel's been doing.
Yeah.
So little kids, sure, they're targets because they're potential Hamas names. Right?
So it sounds like you don't really see any viable road towards lifting the siege ahead.
Well,
What does it look like?
What does it look like in terms of lifting the siege? Well, Israel's not going to do it by itself, right? As long as Israel is supported, they're not going to lift the siege. So I think, again, this is why boycott, divestment, and sanctions is such an important movement, and it's so important to build this pressure. Arms embargoes, these kinds of things. It's so important to start putting this pressure in a major way, and there have been some successes, right? So, and I think it's really important not to let go of those successes. Like, it's actually really important to look at the gains that have been made, and Israel knows it. And I think the way we understand this is because Israel is making it harder and harder to talk about BDS within Israel itself, and then there's this claim of like, oh, you know, if you're talking about boycott, divestment, and sanctions, then you want the Warsaw Ghetto all over again. You know, you're Nazis and you want to eliminate the Jews. This is clearly not true, right? But this is what gets trotted out over and over again. Like, I remember hearing about not buying Jewish products, right? That's what you'll hear people say. In 1939, they said that. It's like, yeah, that's true. But boycott, divestment, and sanctions doesn't say don't buy Jewish products. It says don't buy products that support the Israeli military. It's an important distinction.
The Israeli population doesn't really see what's going on. Do they not see it?
You know, I can't speak for the, okay, so the question is, does the Israeli population see what's going on? Or, you know, do they not see it? Look, I can't speak for the entire Israeli population, but I do know they have Haaretz, which is one of the, with Gidon Levy and with Amira Haas, is one of the most open sort of media sources on this topic. They're not shy about saying what's going on. The Israelis know what's happening, right? But there is a willingness for this to happen, right? And I can say that with people that I know and I'm related to, that I hear this kind of rhetoric that kill them, they deserve what they get. If they don't want to kill babies, they shouldn't make them human shields, which is absolute and total nonsense, as we know. But this is the rhetoric that you hear among the Israeli population. But this is not new. This has been going on since before the occupation began. Israelis know what's happening. They know it. But again, just as nationalism is a complicated and problematic thing among Palestinians, it's also complicated and problematic for Israelis.
It seems that over the last decade, and probably before that, there's been an increasing sort of unwillingness to really engage in the truth behind how many people have been killed in these humanitarian disasters and wars. 100,000 Iraqis, you know, the 1,000 people in Syria, in Gaza repeatedly, and I'm just curious whether the the state of denial, the unwillingness to sort of see what that means, may be it may be easier to target the American public with an economic argument, talking about the money, which is a more tangible thing, how much it costs to support the Gazan economy, how much it costs to destroy it, and to do that repeatedly. I mean, I remember my brother was director of INERA in the Middle East, and he wouldn't believe the work that they went to just to get permission to use the USAID money or private donations to build a warehouse for produce, and then Israel owns it, and we're paying for it.
Right, and that's actually one of, I'm writing a piece about this right now about desalination, because in 2011 UNICEF created what's called a tender. So they said, we want people to bid on a contract to build the desalination plant in Gaza. They gave it to Neurosoft, which is an Israeli company. Right? So then the Israelis will make money both for bombing things and then rebuilding them afterwards and then bombing them again. That contract fell through largely because Gazans went on strike and said they weren't going to work there. So UNICEF had to redo the tender. But yeah, I mean, there are a huge number of economic forces that are causing this to continue.
But don't you think the American taxpayer can, if they knew, the fact that, listen, this is a dysfunctional economic model. This is supported in some degree by the world community. I don't know how much of that is U.S. or how much of it is European or whatever, but and it's amazing how productive the people of Gaza are with the limitations of everything. But and then the cost of maintaining a military that can destroy it. I mean, can't we just look at those numbers? And I mean, I would like to be able to look at the number of people killed also, but it seems like people can relate to those numbers. What it costs.
Well, there are some folks who are doing that kind of calculation. So, for example, Shir Hever is an Israeli economist, Shirhever. He's an Israeli economist who's written a series of pamphlets and then wrote a book called The Political Economy of Occupation. And he actually looks at the money. He actually looks at the amount of money going in, amount of money going out, like all this kind of thing. And I agree with you. I think it's a great argument, and it's a great logical argument. And I like logic. But the thing is that, I mean, if you look at how we spend our money in this country, like, it seems like we have a problem with logic when it comes to spending money, right? How much did the Iraq War cost? You guys probably know, right? 1.7 trillion, is that about right? I might be wrong with those numbers, but it's somewhere in that neighborhood, certainly in the trillions. So we do it anyway, I think it's a great argument to make. I mean, I think there's a lot of strange contradictions here when we talk about it. I mean, you talk about conservatives that are talking about a powerful America, a patriotic America. We have to fight for a strong America. Why are they allowing U.S. foreign policy to be determined by this teeny, dinky country in the Middle East? That seems anything but, the manly, patriotic, nationalistic vision. Why would you allow this country who doesn't have the United States' best interests in mind, why would you let them determine what our foreign policy is going to be?
Why are they?
Well, that's a much more complicated question in terms of why are they. I don't think we have time for that.
It was 9 o'clock, and I don't want to tire you out too much. I also want to point out, for example, the source that you had, Jewish Voice for Peace. We have a lot of copies of their information back here, and they're online. And other organizations, If Americans Knew, there's a lot of data on that website. And so you can find that information, but you can't get it from New York Times or Olympia. So, but you can find it. So I want to thank Ron for coming. And hope people.
Thank you for all your patience.